Welcome to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz, coming to you from Sacramento, California, and we are joined by the GOP leader in the California State Senate. His name is Bob Huff. You know him well. And I want to speak with you about education. Since I've known you, you've been looking at trying to propose and pass good common sense education reforms. The most recent one dealt with the flurry of layoff notices that teachers and other educational staffs were receiving during the downturn. My aunt got one, actually, and she actually got two. 1 year got rescinded, the next year it went into effect. So talk to us about the whole process and what you're trying to do.
State law requires that if a school is going to let go of a teacher, they have to notify that teacher by March 15th, which is well and good. That gives teachers a long time to think about it, perhaps put the feelers out and find a job. The problem is schools don't really know what their budget's going to be like March 15th. Because the governor puts out the preliminary budget in January, but the May revision is generally more focused. And so school districts look at that as like, how much money are we going to get? And so my bill would have put in line more of that timing to the budget so that we don't go through all this artificial churning of the workforce and creating all this angst.
It would seem to me that if I were a teacher, I would want the deadline pushed to where it could seem more definitive. I mean, to receive a notice on, let's say, March 15th, and then to have it rescinded on May 15th or June 15th, whenever it is. I mean, that's tremendous anxiety.
It's like cruel and unusual punishment.
One could argue, right? One could argue. Yeah. But for whatever reason, and maybe you can enlighten us, the bill died.
Right.
The bill did die in committee. What happened?
Well, the only opposition against it, but I shouldn't say only because it's very substantive, were the school unions.
The CTA.
Exactly. And they're arm in arm. It wasn't just the CTA, but any union that represents a school employee. Right. They all tend to come together to oppose these things, but they opposed it. And one could argue, because I've pondered, I've heard from young teachers that go through this. Some have left the workforce because I just can't go through this every year. And it drives people crazy, but the unions like to keep pressure on the budget. So even though the notice is meaningless because there's no data to drive it, the schools have to over-notify. Otherwise, it takes them a full year before they can go through that again. And when you don't have the money to pay the bills, that's a significant timeline.
Is there a cost to the noticing?
There is a cost. It's estimated that it was running, I'm going to say $700
Yeah,
each.
I mean, it seems like at some level, there was an example you offered me. In San Jose, 32 teachers cost $29,000.
Legislative analysts put it at 700, I believe it was. This school district was in testifying that, it was a little bit, it was around that amount of money, and then they didn't actually end up letting anybody go. So that was in their case, $29,000 that could have gone into the classroom, could have gone for much needed, and instead it's just, off in the wind with nothing other than they've created some angst in the workforce.
Now, as I understand it, the Senate Education Committee, it is dominated by Democrats, 7 Dems, 2 Reaps, yet not every Dem voted against it.
I actually had the chairman, Carol Liu, and I had Lou Correa from Orange County that supported my position.
So you were close.
I was close.
5-4, is that right?
One more vote.
Yeah.
One more vote got it out of committee.
Do you feel as if that you could bring this back, or is it just one of those issues that to get that just one vote is really going to be the killer?
This is interesting. That one vote is the killer.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason why this committee is so packed, much more than what our numbers are.
Right. Usually it's more like a 60-40 split, not as
or even 70-30. But this is very egregious and a tough threshold. Before we lost numbers from 15 down to 11 over the redistricting. Now we're up to 12.
Well, when we come back, I want to continue our conversation about education, about the budget. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, sir, let's talk about the budget, if we may. It's interesting. I receive your press releases religiously. I enjoy reading them very much. And it does seem that the Senate Republicans were pleasantly surprised by the governor's budget, or at least at some level thought it was a fine starting point. At some level, it seems as if the Senate Republicans and the governor are better friends than some of the Assembly Democrats and the governor. But be that as it may, what would you say about the budget?
Well, one could argue this is a Republican budget. These are the principles, for the most part, that we have been advocating for some years now, and the governor finds himself the most conservative vote when it comes to the budget matters. Now this is a majority vote budget. So he has to draw the strong, conservative, let's be prudent fiscal guys rather than the Republicans of the room, but we're happy he's taken our ideas.
Right. So that being said, when we look at the budget, it's undeniable that boy, the economic situation is so different than it was a couple of years ago. I mean, we had a deficit of almost $27 billion. Now we have a surplus, it looks like over $4 billion. Do you buy that, first of all? I mean, are we really in much better shape?
We are in much better shape, and ironically, Prop 30, that was what raised the taxes, in hindsight, wasn't necessary. Some of us said that
Some have
at the
said
time.
that, yes.
Now the governor quickly segues and says, well, we got this debt, which is true, but you know, there are economists that will say that you can come out of a recovery better by cutting back the scope of government rather than growing it, and we did just the opposite. We're continuing to grow government jobs.
So that being said, if Prop 30 wasn't needed, or if it was, we don't know, but what we do know is we have a surplus. Should we look at cutting taxes right now?
I think we should be looking at cutting taxes. In fact, the Dems are doing a little two-step over there to make sure they don't get too much reserve, because there's evidently something on the books that says they have to kick back some sales tax if it reaches a 4% surplus.
Interesting.
So they will encumber enough to make sure it doesn't hit that threshold. But we should definitely, I mean, Prop 30 is the law of the land. We should be using that money to pay down the debt, because that is a real number when you're looking at the underfunded pensions and all the other things that are just out there waiting to.
Well, let's talk about the debt, because the governor has been very clear that he wants to really tear down that wall of debt, his term of art. One of the ways that you tear down that wall of debt is you pay it off, and there's some of that going on in the proposed budget, but you also can look at creating a reserve. And so if the wall of debt starts to build up, that may be a place that you can turn. We know that there are competing proposals for a rainy day fund. What can you tell us about the rainy day fund that has been proposed by the governor? There's one that's also been proposed, ACA 4. Where are you on the rainy day fund issue?
I think the voters ought to have an up-down vote on ACA 4. It was part of a bipartisan budget back in, I think, 2009. Kind of lose track.
Right.
But the Democrats have kicked it off. They found out they could do that by majority vote, and they don't need our vote to kick it down the road, so it may never come to a vote. But that was actually a very robust rainy day fund that looked back and had sort of an average of how much you put
Right,
aside.
and let me ask you about that, because you described it well. It is an average, how much money should put into the reserve based upon looking at trends.
Right.
The governor's rainy day proposal doesn't look at averages. He wants to zero in on capital gains and use that as the barometer for how much the state should put aside. What do you think about that formula?
I think the formula that we had made more sense, because it balances all sources of revenue, because, I mean, sometimes things get out of whack, and certainly capital gains are something that aren't steady from year to year, and we'd have to take a look at it. I just know ACA 4 was something that didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of thought that went into it. It was well crafted. It was a bipartisan agreement. We just ought to have a vote on that. I think we would find that a lot more robust, again, to use that word, than the governor's.
At the same time, we do have a rainy day fund mechanism. It's called Prop 58, and yet we're really not funding Prop 58. We haven't for years. And so how do we know that if ACA 4 passes, or if a version of it passes, that we would fund it?
Well, ACA 4 tried to build upon the weaknesses of the previous version, because you find out what the loopholes are, because attorneys find ways to exploit them. And certainly ACA 4...
Attorneys do. I know, I'm one.
Well, there you go. That explains a lot.
A ton. But would ACA 4 kind of plug that loophole? Because in the final analysis, it's great to have a rainy day fund, but if it's not being funded, what's the point?
Well, there's no rainy day fund if it doesn't work. So yeah, we believe ACA 4 would plug that.
So to get it to the ballot, it needs to pass the legislature, is that right?
It's already passed the legislature. They just have to put it on the ballot. See, they moved it, so it's currently set, I think it's set for a vote in 2014.
I think you're right.
They will likely kick it off to something else.
We'll see.
Or they'll come up with something else and say, this is the new rainy day.
Okay, his name is Bob Huff. He is the GOP leader in the California State Senate. My name is Brad Palmer. This is California Edition.